the webinar entitled Integrating Youth Development and Nature for Youth to Reach Their Full Potential. I am here. My name is CJ Goulding. I'm the Manager of Community Leadership Development with the Children in Nature Network. I will be the moderator for today's conversation. The format of our session today is a facilitated discussion with our guests shown here, and then we will open it up to questions from participants. If you have questions or comments, we're going to rely on the chat function, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a drop-down menu where you can select to send your message to the moderator or to everyone. My colleague, Monica Lopez-McGee, will be gathering all the questions for us to field at the end of the webinar. If there's a clarifying question, we might pause to make sure everything is clear. Otherwise, we'll open the webinar to the Q&A at the end. Once we begin the actual presentation, we will place everyone on mute to ensure we don't have any background noise or feedback issues. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available for you to reference, watch again, and to share. So first, let me introduce, I'll introduce what the main theme and of the webinar and the conversation is, and then we'll introduce our partners to be able to kick us off and get us started on this discussion. For those who work in the fields of youth development and nature, we understand that that both of those fields are important. Oftentimes, however, the intentional integration of both of those fields together isn't done to the fullest extent. And research shows that intentional integration amplifies the benefits of each and produces new outcomes for youth to reach their full potential. Our colleagues from Search Institute have done as a part of this project, have done a literature review of the research that exists, and community-based organizations and leaders from Grand Rapids and Atlanta. We have all partnered to explore what works in supporting young people's growth on a number of youth development and nature-based outcomes and strategies. This webinar will include that conversation on a high level. We will share some of the research review that was performed, and hopefully we'll be providing other opportunities for folks to engage in this conversation and in this content, because we know that there's a lot of expertise from all of you who are practitioners in either youth development programs or in nature-based and connection to nature programming. This project, first of all, I do want to thank and acknowledge our partners who have been a part of this. We also want to acknowledge the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, who was a sponsor in helping to make this happen. Introducing our speakers, our partners from Search Institute. We have Jenna, Sethi, and Clare Eisenberg, and I'll give them a moment to introduce themselves. And then we will introduce our other partner.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. Hi, Jenna Sethi, research scientist at Search Institute, and I specialize in qualitative work. So I have the privilege of listening to young people's stories a lot of the time for my job.
And I'm Clare Eisenberg with Search Institute, and I'm also a qualitative researcher along with Jenna.
And joining us from Grand Rapids, we have Shannon Harris. Shannon, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, CJ. Good afternoon. Shannon Harris of Our Community's Children, which is a public-private partnership between the City of Grand Rapids Public Schools, and community partners. And we exist to create programs and to facilitate initiatives that better prepare young people for college, work, and for life.
Fantastic. We also, as a part of this, we also worked with a cohort of folks from Atlanta, and they, a representative of the work in Atlanta, will be joining us on the call as well. To provide some context, One, I saw at the beginning, I led off talking about how this project was an investigation into the integration of youth development and nature based programming looks like. And one of the key elements that we want to acknowledge, hold up, and learn in this process is the role that equity plays in this conversation, as it does in many areas of life. One of the key comments in the conversations that we've had as a cohort over the past 11 months is the idea that you can't talk about reintegrating or reconnecting children to nature without talking about the what separated them in the first place, and that came from one of the cohort representatives of Biadoon in Atlanta. And so just at the top of the call, a couple of the ways that that's one of the ways that we're addressing equity. I see that folks are putting their ancestral lands, the name of their ancestral lands, and the folks who have stewarded that land and who are still on that land. That's another way that we can address equity as well. The structure of this project and cohort was started around 11 months ago, and so it involved monthly calls with groups in Atlanta and in Grand Rapids where we discussed different elements of how this integration might occur. We discussed updates and learnings that these cohorts brought to the table, and made efforts to weave the review of current literature and research with community-based expertise, modeling more effective ways of research. And one final point, we also led to the Children in Nature International Inside Out Summit, which took place last month, and now is continuing with today's webinar, and will continue with other ways to engage moving forward. In this conversation, the last thing I want to acknowledge before we get into the crux and the core of our conversation is that this is not an extensive, we finished it, it's done conversation. This is not presenting expertise as the end-all be-all of this topic. This is simply a high-level introduction to provide language, to provide a framework, to provide questions for you to ponder, and then hopefully we can continue to provide opportunities where you can contribute to that conversation as well. So as we go through this, as we talk about the research, as we talk about the expertise that these organizations present, think about the question of what's missing and what you might add to the conversation. And with all that being said, let's dive into the core of the topic. At its highest level, right before I hand it to Serge, at its highest level, folks might often have questions about what youth development and what nature-based programming are and look like. And so, for the context of this webinar, we understand youth development to be programming that aims at developing the young leaders to their highest and fullest potential, and nature-based programming involving being a bucket that involves anything connecting children and young people to nature. So just keep those things in mind as we move forward. With that being said, I will pass the mic to our colleagues at Search Institute to share a little bit about what they uncovered in their literature review, and we'll dive into the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. I think we'll have a slide that'll pop up here. I think Monica is going to share a slide. But our project we termed Integrating Youth Development in Nature and Exploration. And at Search Institute, we're a nonprofit dedicated to positive youth development and equity. And in the last 6 to 7 years, we've been focusing on how young people develop through nature-based programs and youth development programs. And when we had this opportunity to partner with Children Nature Network through this Bechtel grant and do a little bit more in-depth exploration of literature in this space, we were really excited about that. But like CJ said, this is just one one way to look at youth development nature-based programming. And, it was kind of what we call a focused literature review. So it's not exhaustive of all the literature in both fields of youth development nature, but we really wanted to look at what are the types of programs that are being studied that are doing both, that are really thinking about like what works in youth development, what works in nature, and integrating those things. And so that's really the focus, is that intersection. We're also very honored to work with the Grand Rapids and Atlanta nature leaders cohorts, because they provided so much great insight into the project. So you'll note them along the bottom of the screen there too. So we're going to kick it off and talk a little bit about the outcomes that we learned about. And I'm going to hand it over to Claire to share some of those with you.
Yeah, so to begin, we'll give an overview of the outcomes that the literature illustrated. And we focused on kind of a select few because there are so many outcomes. So if this is something you're interested in, you can go and find academic outcomes, emotional outcomes, physical outcomes, psychological outcomes. But we focused on just a few categories. So Monica, you can move to the next slide, please. So we really wanted to look at outcomes that happen kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram where youth development and nature come together. So we identified 4 key categories in the literature, and these outcomes were also identified as priorities by members of the Grand Rapids and Atlanta nature leaders cohorts. So those broad categories are personal development, agency, connection to place and community, and leadership skills. And we can move to the next slide. So within each of these 4 core categories, there's some subcategories, which you can see along the side there. For the sake of time today, we're not going to go super in depth on all of these, but we'll give kind of an overview of some of the key ideas within each. So the first one, we can move to the next slide. The first one we'll talk through is personal development. So this includes young people having a deeper understanding of themselves, developing new or different perspectives, or a stronger sense of self-concept. It also involves having greater self-esteem, self-confidence, motivation, and self-respect. A lot of the cohort members also shared that when their programs really emphasize cultural relevance and connectedness, it helped young people build stronger confidence in their cultural identities as well. We'll dig into that a little bit later on in our presentation too. Some other aspects of personal development are developing an environmental ethos and an appreciation for nature, as well as making future career and education choices that are based on their experiences engaging in nature. So these are sometimes called green collar career paths. We can move on to the next slide, Monica.
All right, so another outcome that young people experience when they're in programs that are being intentional around nature and youth development is a sense of agency. And so within that, the idea of sort of self-efficacy and being resilient, and then also having sort of social justice and environmental justice oriented behaviors. And self-efficacy often includes a sense of resilience. So nature-based programming provides opportunities for young people to build resilience and confidence and the ability to overcome challenges. When you feel more connected to nature, they're often more likely to want to protect it. And they may begin to start to see themselves as agents of change for environmental issues and develop more of an emotional connection to environmental issues rather than simply knowing about it or thinking about it in kind of an abstract way. In one study that we looked at, youth who participated in a conservation program felt more responsible for addressing issues that they noticed in their community after their participation.
So our next category is leadership skills. So this for us included social skills or social emotional skills, decision-making skills, and adaptability. So there's a really wide range of social skills, but some examples of social skills could be communication, teamwork, respect, cooperation, among many, many others. Decision-making skills include anticipating and evaluating possible outcomes of decisions and making decisions based on your own internal values. So some studies that we looked at found that the decision-making skills that young people might build in a nature-based program will continue to serve them in other contexts. So if they build these skills in a nature-based program, they may also be applying them in school or another activity. Research has also shown that emotional intelligence can be strengthened through nature-based youth development. So that includes things like building adaptability or flexibility. And one study found that out of all the outcomes they observed in young people through a nature-based program, building adaptability was one of the most significant and longest lasting outcomes. So that's a really strong and helpful outcome for young people. And we can go to the next slide.
The final outcome we're going to share today, and I should note too, and CJ, you probably noted this, but this deck, a more thorough version of this deck is going to be available as a tool for people to look at, and that will have all the literature and citations. So if there's things that kind of piqued your interest today and that you want to go more in depth with, there'll be a resource for you to do that. So the final outcome we want to talk about that is part of young people being in programs that focus on youth development nature intentionally is the connection to place and to community. Nature-based youth development programs often involve experiences shared by a group of participants, including going through challenges, sometimes being in unfamiliar settings. And this can strengthen the social connections of that group of participants. You can develop a sense of place through nature-based programming, feeling a sense of attachment and location to the program. Placemaking, which is a concept rooted in some indigenous cultures, emphasizes the ways in which people connect to a physical place and conceptualize nature as lived places they're experienced, embodied, and cultured. Programs that recognize indigenous people whose land programs take place on provide participants with cultural context of place, which can lead to critical consciousness as well, tied to place, in which young people understand a place through the lens of decolonization and environmental equity. And now we can move to the next slide, and Claire's going to talk a little bit about the framework that we came up for programs to think about where they might lie along this basically continuum of development in both youth development and nature-based programming.
Yeah, so as part of this project, we conceptualized together with the Children in Nature Network staff and cohort members a visual framework that can depict the many ways in which youth development and nature can intersect. So rather than representing it with one specific intersection point, like where an X would come together, like Jenna said, we're looking at this as kind of a spectrum or continuum. So programs might find themselves at a lot of different intersection points depending on their approach, their context, their participants, and their goals. So Monica, if you want, there's animation on this slide. So if you want to advance a few times and we can get some of the different intersections on there, you can see how different programs might land in their own sort of intersection. We'll talk through a couple examples and then we'll hear from Shannon about a little bit more about sort of how programs think about where they might place themselves. So on the bottom there, you can see kind of an arrow with focus on nature engagement. So that's how focused intentionally a program is on including nature. And then on the side, it's focused on youth development. So how intentional are they about those youth development principles? At Search Institute, we added the examples that have asterisks on there. So Camp Lead is a summer camp that really intentionally blends a youth development curriculum with whitewater rafting trips. So they're both intentional on nature engagement and youth development. The Student Conservation Association is an organization that aims to develop young people into conservation leaders and environmental stewards. So they're a little more intentional when it comes to nature engagement than youth development, although they have kind of recently broadened their scope to dig into youth development more. Another example that presents a little bit of contrast is Big Brothers Big Sisters. So they're a youth development focused mentoring program. So they aren't really intentionally including nature in their program model. While mentor pairs may engage in nature-based activities, it's not integral to their mission or goals. And so they're a lot higher on the youth development intentionality spectrum than they are in the nature engagement spectrum. The other examples there came from the cohorts. So we'll dig into that more, but kind of the big thing to keep in mind with this is there's no one right place to be on this continuum or within this framework. It really is sort of a tool to reflect, where are you? Is that where you want to be? Or would you want to maybe shift in a different direction based on program goals? So that's sort of an overview of our framework here.
Awesome. Shannon, like Harris, who we have represented here. Monica, do you mind leaving it, putting it back up just for a little bit? Shannon Harris, who we have represented here as a participant in the Grand Rapids cohort. Shannon, where do you think our community's children might fall on this spectrum that we have shown here?
You know, CJ, you asked me this question at the conference, and I struggled to really pinpoint where we are, only because, you know, our community's children is a partnership, a public-private partnership between the city and the schools and community partners. And so we have a whole host of partners and community-based organizations, like Camp Newaygo that's on that map there. And everyone is doing great work. So we've had some of our partners that are really strong in that youth development sector. And then we have partners that are really strong in that nature-based sector. And what we've tried to do is we've really tried to map where people are, or map our system, I should say, and what currently exists in our community, who's doing what well. And so I would probably put us collectively, with all of our partners collectively in our system map, probably somewhere in between the Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and the Park Pride, like in that middle space there. And again, you know, a lot of our partners are all the way up at the top, like Camp Newaygo. And we have partners like, just like the Big Brother, Big Sisters, although they're not as specific partners of ours, that are more in that youth development track. So I would probably put us right there in the center, in that blank space right there.
And you mentioned doing like a scan of what exists and what are some of the things that you learned in doing that scan? I'm sure like you realize, oh, we have connections here and here and here and here, like, and you understand a little bit better where you're situated. But what is some of the things that you learned in doing that, in going through that assessment?
That a lot of people are doing a lot of great things, like Elgrow, and I know that Eileen is on here on this call. A lot of people are doing a lot of great things, and what we've also learned is that we need a common vision. So we have a vision to better prepare young people for college, work, and life, but we also have a vision that youth need to have equitable access to natural places and spaces for a happy, healthy life. And so kind of going through the discussion about how do we define youth development, as you just did at the beginning of this call, what is the definition of youth development? What's the definition of nature-based engagement or programming? And really coming to an intersection of how can we work together to really improve outcomes for youth? And the Search Institute did a great job in that Venn diagram, really describing or illustrating those quadrants around agency. So how do young people make decisions towards their North Star, their personal development, the connection to where they live in their community, their leadership skills. We've also talked about really wanting to increase exposure to the outdoors and making the outdoors a habit. We want to give young people opportunities to be employed in this space. So what kind of youth development skills are they going to need to move them towards that career pathway? We've also talked about social and emotional skills that they're going to need to be successful, whatever career path they go into, and of course now, and looking at their future sense of self. So how do they see themselves today, and then how do they see themselves in the future? And then, talking about growth mindset. So it's Search Institute really covered those 4 quadrants that, we've really worked in, and definitely youth development. And we're seeing that there's a lot of overlap in the nature-based engagement as well.
Awesome. You mentioned the youth employment, and the next question I was going to ask was around some of the things that you've learned or might be doing differently as a result of this conversation. This is kind of a teeing up question because we've talked about this, and I know that you all are doing some work with the Gear Library. But can you tell us a little bit more about how that is one of the steps you all have taken forward in integrating these two together?
Absolutely. So we've had a long history of youth development and youth employment in this community. So not only just our community's children, but there are several youth serving organizations that do youth employment as well. And so when we had the opportunity to really get into the nature-based space with Children in Nature, with the National League of Cities, with the Outdoor Foundation, we really wanted to beef up our nature-based engagement with our young people. As I mentioned, we've had youth employment initiatives in the city of Grand Rapids, and really wanting to grow our own. And so when these opportunities became available, youth employment was probably at the top of the list. One of the things at the top of the list, in addition to green playgrounds, and I know that Jamie's on here too, what we've done is with our community partners, we've created a gear library / adventure club committee. And this is a community committee. And we came up with a strategy of creating a gear library here in the city of Grand Rapids. So in all honesty, I had no idea what a gear library was, had no clue until we started doing this work a couple of years ago. But we've located a space, so it is real. It's in an underserved neighborhood. And as a community, we decided that, and as a committee, we decided that we really needed to uplift the talents of our young people that live in the neighborhood. So we're really focusing on recruiting young people that live in the neighborhood to work in our gear library. And as a matter of fact, we're going through interviews right now. We have young people that we have identified that we think will be a good fit to work in the gear library as a gear library coordinator. So what that will entail is not only checking out gear, but it's also working with out-of-school time providers and young people in underserved neighborhoods to get them more exposed to the outdoors. So yes, we'll have those peak experiences of going camping and hiking and backpacking, but we also want to provide them with equipment and gear that they can use and wear every single day of the year. So right now it is about 43 degrees in Grand Rapids, and it's sunny, and the leaves are on the ground. So what are those everyday activities that we can really promote in the gear library so that young people have a repeated exposure to the outdoors year round?
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. One of the things that we've learned, and I think that one of the things and the point that was brought up previously, is that this spectrum, this framework tends to set folks up, and I think it's kind of like the idea of when folks used to hand out papers, teachers used to hand out papers to grade in middle school, and you get your own paper back, and you're like, okay, did I get this right? 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 Okay, I'm gonna check all these off. I'm gonna put myself far at the top right corner of the screen because I think we're doing absolute excellent work, and I'd like to pat ourselves on the back because we're doing the best. Part of this framework and this assessment and this conversation is about again deepening the understanding, and so these are rays and arrows that show that there's always the intention is that there's always room to grow. One of the things that we have pointed out in our conversations around this framework is the idea of, so organizations like Park Pride, Student Conservation Association, and Big Brothers Big Sisters, although they exist at what might look like extremes on this framework, that simply means that they have deeper expertise in that area of the content. And so for someone who might work for Camp Lead or Wawa or Youth Tree Team, pointing or being in connection and being in cohort with organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters or Boys and Girls Clubs gives an opportunity to learn from people who are experts in youth development. For organizations like who feel like they're in the middle and doing it very well, or who are at one extreme or the other, to be able to learn from an organization like Student Conservation Association or Park Pride, this framework helps put you in a space where you can say, these are folks who are deep experts in an issue. These are folks who are doing it in a blended way. And these are the ways that we can learn from each other. And so as you look at this framework, as you think about where you are thinking about, as you think about where your organization might position or sit, do a little bit of what our community's children did, and think about the people you're in partnership or connected with, and what you might be able to learn from them to deepen this integration here. And if you do all that and grade your paper and it's still a 10 out of 10, we will also accept that. Jenna and Claire, so we've talked about the outcomes. We've talked a little bit about the overview. In your dive and many hours spent diving through the literature, what are some of the best practices that came up in order to achieve this outcome? What are some of the ways that approaches people can take in order to integrate nature and youth development to the best of their ability?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, what's happening in this intersection that works? You can go to the next slide, Monica. Hopefully this is helpful, kind of like the other graphic was helpful in thinking about the outcomes. So there are four kind of main themes that rose to the top as we were looking through the literature about what's really working in that intersection, the program elements that lead to success. And that is integrating unique opportunities provided by nature, consistent time for individual and group reflection, inclusively and intentionally building relationships, and then providing space that affirms young people's identities, perspectives, and leadership. And we'll go into a little bit more depth what each of those are. So you can move to the next slide. So when nature and youth development are thoughtfully integrated, nature is not what we might say the backdrop just to youth development activities, but it's integral to the experiences. For most, being in nature is a change from their usual environment, both in terms of the physical space that somebody occupies, but also in terms of their perspective. Young people might notice things that they might not typically perceive in their regular lives. They might take on different social roles in those settings, working in groups often. They also might be away from home or school or work stressors that are a little bit different. And so some people talk about the nature as a place to maybe escape or unplug from technology. And while there are some nature-based programs that have little to no access to technology, either intentionally or because of the remote location that they're in, but technology can also be a medium for engagement. For example, young people might be able to use their cell phones to document an experience in nature and have a discussion around it. Nature settings provide challenging yet attainable activities where youth can take risks and experience accomplishment and success, especially when the challenges are appropriately scaffolded for them.
You can move to the next slide, Monica. Awesome. So the next practice is consistent time for reflection. So this really draws on principles of experiential learning for the educators out there. So when young people have the opportunity to undertake a task and experience a sense of mastering that task, and receiving feedback through reflection, either from themselves, their peers, facilitators, or even the physical environment that they're in. They make meaning from that experience and it can help them grow. So this helps participants connect their experiences in nature to other situations outside of nature where their learnings might also be relevant. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with some of the outcomes showing up in other contexts in addition to nature. So often these experiences are new for young people. They may be experiencing challenges that are uniquely afforded by the natural setting. And so spending time kind of intentionally processing these experiences can really deepen their learning and growth. Research has shown that the nature-based teaching style tends to be really hands-on, youth-centered, activity-based, and discussion-based. And research has also shown that this approach is not limited to nature settings. So when teachers use this approach in a traditional classroom, it can actually outperform traditional teaching approaches. So it works in nature, it works out of nature as well. So examples of this could involve practicing group outdoor survival tasks, and then individually reflecting on a group to evaluate how the tasks went, discussing challenges and successes, and then making plans for how they might improve the next time. Another cohort member shared an example about a program that encourages young people to use photography as a storytelling to sort of share their personal narrative, and then they share their documentation with the group as a method of reflecting. You can go to the next slide.
So the third element about kind of what works in this intersection is inclusively and intentionally building relationships. And that's between adults and youth, but it's also between young people and their peers, because those things are foundational to positive youth development outcomes. And it's important that relationship building is inclusive. So that means all participants in the program have equitable opportunities to build relationships, both with adults and peers, and that those relationships are inclusive of all the aspects of their own identities as well. Nature experiences often involve small groups that are sometimes isolated or separated from others, and this allows for conflict resolution, trying on new social roles, practicing communication. Positive relationships can be viewed as both an outcome of programming, but also an important ingredient to the experience. And the dynamics of group experiencing nature together and learning together has also been associated with positive youth development outcomes. And finally, the fourth one that we're going to talk about today is youth identities, perspectives, and leadership are affirmed in programs that are being intentional about youth development and nature-based programming. So responsive programs provide space that affirms young people's identities, perspectives, and leadership. And these leadership roles can include being responsible and accountable for tasks and having roles that situate young people as experts within the group. Some leadership roles also engage youth in teaching their peers. Nature also provides a setting and context for youth participation in civic initiatives, particularly relating to environmental justice. When programs invite youth voice, young people are feeling more heard, believing that their input is important and that they've made a contribution to their community. Inviting youth to participate as their whole selves and share their identities is important for positive growth. One study found that youth are participating in nature and art-based civic engagement project designed to be culturally relevant, showed an increase in sense of contribution to their community, feeling heard, and that their input was important. However, the literature also shows that there are many programs that use a more Eurocentric or individualistic approach that does not necessarily affirm the identities of participants of different backgrounds. There can be a bit of a conquering nature mentality in some outdoor adventure programs that runs counter to Indigenous cultures. In exploring the affirmation of youth identities, the concepts of cultural responsiveness, competence, and relevance were less prevalent in the academic literature around nature-based programming than other elements. Even though the concept of cultural responsiveness wasn't prevalent in the literature, in our monthly calls with the nature leaders cohorts, they noted these concepts as highly important to their programming. So alongside the literature, we want to center their voices and highlight their experience and expertise and suggestions about how to affirm young people's identities. So these are a few suggestions from the Nature Leaders Cohort about how to be culturally responsive in their programming. One is to hire staff who reflect young people's particular racial identities. As one cohort member noted, we ensure that we have representation from the community in front of our students. Those are in front of our students are those people who look like them and are delivering content that aligns with our values and their values too. Another suggestion is discussing the history of place and different individuals' relationships to place, including Indigenous groups who've inhabited and continue to inhabit the area. Programs may use storytelling as a method for understanding stories of a past and present place. Recognizing program participants' cultures. For example, drawing on cultural practices that help Black youth connect with African heritage, even if they cannot trace ancestry to specific countries or regions due to enslavement. Making sure materials are available in different languages. Examining potential barriers to participation and equipping staff to break down those barriers. And avoiding an assimilation-based approach to nature engagement that acknowledges that nature-based experiences include a wide range of activities that can exist in urban environments, not just remote settings. In addition, engaging young people in experiences that do not place remote environments with facilitators who don't reflect their identities can also be successful and expand young people's horizons in a non-assimilative way. And finally, inviting young people to share information about their own identities and cultures. So I'm going to pause here and invite CJ back in to open up the conversation here.
Yes, and I think I will in turn invite Shannon to share some of the. We just shared a lot of best practices and strategies, and my question or invitation to you is: what are some of the best practices that, or what are some of the areas that have been shared, or maybe that have not been shared, that our community's children is trying to get deeper in and to strengthen? What are some of the most effective strategies that you are looking to carry forward?
Yeah, thanks, CJ. You kind of mentioned one of them, just leaning on expertise. So leaning on the expertise of the youth development sector, as well as the nature-based sector, because we really complement each other. So leaning on each other, leveraging resources and expertise. We also, with our out-of-school time network, so we have a out-of-school time network called the Expanding Learning Opportunities Network of out-of-school time providers. We use what's called a youth program quality assessment that really focuses on those best practices of youth development. So from ratios to sharing power to ensuring that young people have a voice in what happens in that space, whether that is youth development or nature-based. They have to feel like they own what they're a part of, and they should, and really sharing that power. Equity is key, honestly. We are intentional about serving young people and young people of color, young people in underserved communities, and we don't apologize for that. So that's a best practice in communicating that and saying that. Professional development, so with our youth workers, making sure that they have the tools that they need to deliver content. And coming with the premise of there's no one way to do nature right. I kind of talked about that earlier. So whether it's a peak experience or an everyday experience, they're all the same, and they all can really improve outcomes for young people. We also have what's called a green, what's it called? Green, and I'm getting this wrong because now that I'm thinking about it, green network. Let's say a green network. Our Grand Rapids Environmental Education Network. I think that's what it's called. And these are the network of educators that are really looking at in-school curriculum and how to integrate nature play and nature curriculum during the school day. How do we complement that after school as well? So, looking at all of those things, those things that the Search Institute just mentioned, are really some of our best practices. And again, our number one goal is to really improve outcomes for youth along the continuum. And how we define youth here, well, I'd say in our community's children, it's school age through 24 years old. Some of our partners are 0 to 24. So it really depends on the kind of work each one of our partners is doing, but our community's children, we're really looking at those school age children up to the age of 24.
Fantastic. That answers one of the questions from the audience, which was what are the age ranges that you work with, and for you all, Jenna and Claire, what some of the age ranges in these studies are, and what we mean when we say youth and young adult. Do you want to add a little bit to that context a bit, and then we'll hop into some of the other questions from the audience?
Claire, you can jump in too. I'd say it was a fairly wide range, probably from like mid-elementary school through, I think what Shannon's saying, young adults, so probably like that 22 to 24 range. So I think you could easily say like 10 to 24 was probably the range of young people's ages in the studies that we looked at.
And so there's also a question about if outcomes are related to earlier experiences in nature, so having those experiences at a younger age. And that is a fantastic question and not something that our literature really touched on. So I'm now very curious to dig into that more, but I can't provide an answer to that definitively at this point.
Awesome. We will attempt to dive right now. Thank you for sharing those perspectives. We will attempt to dive into some of the questions from the audience and participants, and we'll answer as many as we can before closing, and just talking about what might come next. So I think this one goes to Shannon. I think answered this a little bit in her last response, and I'll just put it back to search to see if this popped up in the research. But based on your research, what is the main recommendation? What is the main recommendation or strategy that folks should be moving forward with or leaning towards?
And do we think we mean to,
or do any of them stand out? Yeah, like do any of the strategies stand out or directions that folks should head as a first step in this process of integration?
It's a really good point, because I don't know that they're linear. I don't know that one leads to another. I mean, I would say, and I'm going to, sort of speak from our own work over the last 5 or 6 years at Search Institute, that we found relationships and what we call developmental relationships to be really foundational to almost any aspect. If young people feel safe, they feel cared for, they feel like there's opportunities to share power, to have their possibilities expanded, that does lay a foundation for other pieces to happen well, I think. So that would be just from our own research perspective. We've seen that across multiple in and out of school contexts, that when the solid relationships are there between youth and adults and youth and peers, that a lot of other of these long-term outcomes, whether they be academic or health related or nature-based, that young people really have a foundation to grow. So that would be one thing I would share. Claire, did you want to add?
I totally agree with that. I think relationships are really key, but all these best practices are really intertwined. And so I think it can also depend on a program's context or goals, but relationships are incredibly important.
And I'd highly recommend, if you haven't as an organization already, maybe having a conversation with your staff or with your staff and young people, which would be even better. And look at that framework that we showed, that very simple graph, and ask yourself some questions about where you think you are as an organization. And if you're not giving lots of time for reflection, or you're not focusing on relationships, or you're not maybe providing enough space for young people to share their identities. Maybe those are places where you can grow as an organization and figure out ways to do that.
I think that answer helps to answer one of the additional questions that uh, someone had answered. Someone had asked. Before we move on to that question, though, what about best practices in the research? And maybe this is. Let me not answer it before I ask it. What are some of the best practices or main recommendations to address equity in this intersection or in these two areas? Was there anything that popped up as a best practice to continue to head it towards equity in these fields?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to this. So yes, in the small amount of literature, especially in that intersection, I think that piece about honoring youth identity and perspective is really important, like understanding their cultural background, where they come from, their relationship to the land, like all of those things we heard. But this is only like a handful of studies. And I think this was sort of a big conclusion that we came to through this work, and especially in talking to the Grand Rapids cohort and people like Shannon and Atlanta too, is that on the ground, programs are doing a lot more with being culturally responsive than the literature would indicate right now. There is a gap. There haven't been enough studies done to really demonstrate what these different programs are doing well right now. And I think that's something to examine and something to really think about and research, is why aren't these programs kind of at the forefront of research, and how can they be, and what's the kind of research that actually would best serve them? We would suggest things more like youth participatory action research or community-based participatory research, ways that work with, not on, communities, because a lot of the studies that we looked at weren't particularly community-based.
And I would just add, with racial equity in particular, there are a lot of tools out there that you could use to really assess if you're being equitable. I know that the city of Grand Rapids, and I was part of this team a few years ago, really looked at how do we integrate racial equity in everything that we do. And part of doing that is asking those questions. Who's at the table, who's making the decisions, who's missing. And I think that's the same in youth programming. You have to ask those same questions. Who are those youth leaders that are in front of young people? Are young people getting the same access to those quality programs that exist? And if they aren't, why not? And I think those are some of the questions you have to ask if you're thinking of equity, period, but really equity and gender, or racial equity and gender equity. And you're really providing professional development around those areas as well is very important. And being intentional is one of our core values. So I can't say that it's easy to do, but we know that that is something that has to be done because it's one of our core values and it has to be integrated in everything. It's not a one-off situation. CJ, I think you're muted.
Well, let me do that question over again. Someone had asked how you all are funding the coordinators for the Gare Library, and I think we'll ask. That'll be our last question before we transition.
That would be through the Children in Nature Network. So we've received some grant dollars, and we're leveraging other grants. So our community children, again, is a public-private partnership between the city, Grand Rapids Public Schools, and community partners. And we really look to our local and national partners to really help us leverage the work that we do. And so some of the funding is coming from different pockets from our grantors. So it is grant dollars at this time. Hopefully one day it will be within our general fund at the City of Grand Rapids.
And those grant dollars from the Children in Nature Network pass through from the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation. So we have a couple of their representatives here. So thank you to those who are sponsoring that effort, and those are some of the results that that do come through. So I do want to share. So folks have been adding questions as we've been going through. Unfortunately, we are reaching our time here on this hour, but the energy and the conversation going on in the chat, the opportunities for collaboration, that itself is a positive thing that we will hope to steward moving forward. The questions that were posed in the chat, the ideas that folks are putting out there, the curriculum, all of those things. Our plan is to host future conversations and future discussions on these questions that we weren't able to get to, and give a chance for folks to be able to turn inwards and to collaborate with each other, similarly to how organizations in these cohorts were able to, in order to learn and find better strategies to implement this integration of youth development and connection to nature. Following this call, folks also were asking for some of the resources that were shared, or if they went deeper, or what the research was that was studied in the literature review. We will be sharing contact info for those for the presenters on this webinar, so that if you have any other questions, or we will be sharing contact info, so if you have any other questions, you can ask. Please note that by registering for this webinar, you are also signed up for the research digest. There was a research digest published on this particular topic, and other announcements and communications from the Children in Nature Network. For those of you who are carefully watching your inbox numbers so that they don't creep up very high, and if subscribing is not something you intentionally wanted to do, you may opt to unsubscribe for those communications at any time. Note that this webinar is recorded and will be shared. So you will after the conclusion of this discussion, you will receive a recording of the webinar. You will receive a link to the toolkit that contains the framework, the literature review, the assessment tools, and any other documents that were developed as a part of this process. And you will receive announcements and opportunities to re-engage with this group or with a group of people around this topic. Like we said at the beginning, the goal of this discussion and this group is an intentional integration of youth development with nature experiences. And like Shannon emphasizes, to highlight the importance of to develop the full. Shannon, you probably can say it better than I can. The goal is to develop a full young adult to their best potential. I want to thank Search Institute. I want to thank Shannon for representing on this call. I want to thank the organizations in the Bechtel Atlanta and Bechtel Grand Rapids cohorts for their contribution and time to bring this conversation to this point. And last but not least, I do want to thank you all for your attentive ears, your questions, and your contribution to this webinar today. Thank you all for being here, and hope to see you on our next call and conversation. Bye, everyone.